and I would go and we would wait for my dad, who was returning from the city. We'd watch the trains. We got to know some of the conductors. I guess I pestered them enough and asked them for their expired tickets that they started handing me their tickets. And I used to have a massive collection. I actually still have a pretty big collection of Northeast Corridor, New Jersey transit tickets somewhere in my office. Once I fully organize it, I will be able to find all of them, but I still have them. And a couple years later, when I was in college, I was a history major and I got into photography. And what I ultimately started doing is I merged all my hobbies and it became a perfect storm. And I created a website called railfanning.org that talked about railroads, the history of railroads, and photography. And then my hobby spiraled out of control and I started writing books. And the Northeast Corridor book that I've written is actually my 5th book, and it may never end at this point. I don't know, more to come perhaps. I mentioned all that to say I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and share a little bit of my passion with you. My passion of railroads and railroad history, and certainly when I can tie that into Metuchen, it's a great honor and a great opportunity to do so. As Steve mentioned, we're going to have some time for questions at the end. I'll tell you right now, I may or may not know the answers to your questions, but I'm always happy to take questions and give you answers. I just can't always vouch for the accuracy of the information. It's a little bit of a joke. I work in public relations, so it's a little bit of a public relations joke. I know a few attendees actually on that point did submit questions in advance. And what I've tried to do is when I know the questions, I've tried to tailor answers, my presentation, to include as many answers to those questions as we go throughout. But again, if I don't touch on anything that you were hoping to ask, please feel free to do so at the end. And one additional point that I'll make is, as I jump into this, a true in-depth examination of the Northeast Corridor could probably take days. So I've tried to focus on a few of the highlights and hit some of the high moments, the exciting moments that really illustrate what it took and how the Northeast Corridor became the line that it is today that we know and love and are very familiar with. So I just say that to point that out, that there is so much history involved with the Northeast Corridor, and every town along the route could really be its own presentation. So I just kind of point that out at the onset here. Before I jump too deep into the presentation, I'd like to start with just a quick map, just to make sure that everybody's familiar with the corridor and where it runs. I presume everybody in this group is, but I'll just go ahead and point it out. The entire line runs from Boston to Washington, D.C. And on this map, Boston has that white pin kind of on the top side of it. And Washington, D.C.'s sort of the bottom half middle there, and the blue pin on the map. New York City has the black pin in it, and roughly where we are, or at least virtually are, in Metuchen-Edison, is shown with that red pin. And to me, what is so interesting about this corridor, when we start looking at the history of the corridor, is that today, when we look at it, we tend to think of it as a single line. We think of it right as this entire line that runs from Boston to DC. And it wasn't built that way. It wasn't necessarily intended to be one single route between two cities. It was constructed by many railroads, some of which built only small sections of track. And it really wasn't until the 1960s that the Northeast Corridor took on its name, the Northeast Corridor. But when you look at the railroad today, we really have some incredible visionaries from more than a century ago to thank for building it. They probably didn't realize what they were building when they were doing it. But the legacy of these railroads is still visible along the route today. And as we get deeper into the presentation, we're going to be talking about places like Penn Station, building the tunnels into New York City. And those two in particular are really the lasting legacy of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the work that they did to truly build a technological marvel for the early 20th century. When you think, the Pennsylvania Railroad, they tunneled to New York City. They built grand stations. They electrified the line. It's incredible when we think back on it and look at the line today. It's just incredible to think what they did. And I was trying to think of how we could characterize the Northeast Corridor and talk about how it built, how it evolved. And I kind of went back in mind. I kept hearkening back to that saying about ancient Rome. Rome wasn't built in a day. And you get down onto that. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was the Northeast Corridor. And I think that was probably the biggest thing that, as I delved into it and started studying it, looking at it, is how much it has evolved over time and over the years, and continues to evolve even today. The railroads that became the Northeast Corridor really date to some of the earliest in our country's history. It goes back really to 1830 in New Jersey when the state chartered the Camden and Amboy Railroad. A couple years later, they followed up and chartered the New Jersey Railroad and Transportation Company. But it would take a while for it to go from there. And it would take about 30 years for trains to really start running over the entire New York to Washington run. It's hard to believe, actually, when you think about it, because today you can go hop on an Acela train and you can travel between New York and Washington in less than 3 hours. But when this railroad was built originally, it wasn't the modern and efficient route that we think of today. But that really started to change about a decade after that 1860s date, in 1871, when the Pennsylvania Railroad stepped in and took control. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the standard railroad of the world as it was known. Hang on to that thought as we go through this presentation, the standard railroad of the world. As I mentioned a moment ago, they undertook some incredible infrastructure projects to improve the railroad. And they ran the Northeast Corridor for about a century. And they ultimately faltered in 1968, ushering in the Penn Central era, Conrail era, which really preceded the modern era that we know today. But as we start and build up to the modern era, starting with the early years, I think in some way, this is actually the most interesting era of the Northeast Corridor. And it's a lot like railroads that were built in other parts of the country. Many companies built short sections of tracks between maybe just a couple points. Early railroads didn't necessarily build entire lines across the country. They really built between two cities. And a case in point of that might be the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad, which laid tracks, as its name would suggest, between its two namesake cities, Philadelphia and Trenton. And if you think about that through the lens of today, it doesn't seem that impressive. It just seems like a short stretch of track. But geographically speaking, it was not a simple one to complete. The company began construction in 1833, and they finally opened 8 miles of tracks in Pennsylvania between Morrisville and Bristol. And at first, they operated horse-drawn trains. One of their biggest hurdles to overcome was the Delaware River. And as a lot of railroads did in these early days, what they did is they actually acquired a bridge company. It was a toll bridge company who had a wooden bridge over the Delaware River. And this railroad laid their tracks on the wooden toll bridge across the Delaware River, a bridge that was originally constructed in 1806. And they ran their horse-drawn trains over the bridge to cross the river. A few years later, in 1835, they decided that they would reinforce the bridge so that it could hold the weight of their steam trains. The railroad eventually did complete some other bridges, and it allowed them to connect with the Camden and Amboy Railroad and effectively run their trains from Philadelphia to Jersey City. And this was a common occurrence up and down the Northeast Corridor. And if you look at that on a map, just to really illustrate that point, this is a map from 1848. And if you look at the red dot there is New York. It's actually Jersey City. It's not even New York City. It's Jersey City, which the New Jersey Railroad and Transportation Company built between Jersey City and New Brunswick, which is the white dot. Another railroad, the Camden and Amboy, built from New Brunswick to Trenton. And the Philadelphia and Trenton built the remaining portion of it down to that blue pin in Philadelphia. And it's really incredible, or it was incredible to me when I stopped to think about that. It took 3 railroads to build across New Jersey from New York to Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And even then, you still had to take a ferry to get into New York City. And on the Philadelphia side, the railroad didn't even actually run into Philadelphia. It stopped in a suburb or a part of the city today. It's the Kensington neighborhood of the city. But this was an incredible feat of engineering and construction when you think about it, that they were able to build with these 3 railroads effectively from New York to Philadelphia. And the United States Gazette newspaper in Philadelphia remarked of this, that the complete line formed between New York and Philadelphia is capable of being traversed in 5 or 6 hours. 5 or 6 hours. Not only the citizens of New Jersey, but the whole traveling public will rejoice in the consummation of this event, the newspaper wrote. Incredible, 5 or 6 hours to go from New York to Philadelphia. Hang on to that point too. We're going to come back to that as we get deeper into this. So as I started putting this presentation together, I actually wanted to put out a list of all the railroads. I was going to put them on a slide and just show a list of all the railroads that had a hand in building the Northeast Corridor. I couldn't get it to look good, so I stopped when I got to this point. And I thought this was actually really powerful when you stop and think about it. All these railroads that had a hand in building the Northeast Corridor. Some of them built longer sections than other railroads. Some of these railroads, like the connecting railroad, built from one side of Philadelphia to the other. They just built small little sections, tracks that went barely a couple miles, but they were really important. And together, over the years, they really helped. I mean, that's what formed the Northeast Corridor. And again, it's back to that whole idea that the Northeast Corridor wasn't necessarily planned. Nobody set out from Boston one day, worked their way south to New York City, down to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, to DC, and said, this is where we're going to build the railroad. It didn't happen that way. In some ways, not that it happened by accident, but it evolved over time. And to me, when I was studying it and getting deeper into it, that to me was just really fascinating and really interesting to see how that came to be. On this list of all these railroads, there's really one, I think, that perhaps rises to the top. Not that any one is necessarily more important, but one I think had a really massive impact that just can't be overstated. And that's the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was chartered by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1846. And we could do an entire multiple hours long presentation on the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad and really only hit the highlights and the high points. I don't know if anybody wants to hear me talk for hours. So I'm going to attempt to highlight the Pennsylvania Railroad's role in the Northeast Corridor in a few minutes, and starting with some of the individuals who led the transformation. On this slide, I've put four gentlemen who played really significant roles. The first person I wanted to highlight is on the left here, John Edgar Thompson. He was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1852 to 1874. And under his leadership, the railroad grew exponentially. It was under him that the Pennsylvania actually acquired what was then the United New Jersey Railroad and Canal Company, which was effectively the New Jersey Railroad and the Camden and Amboy Railroad, which had the Northeast Corridor section in New Jersey. In May of 1874, the New York Herald wrote in Thompson's obituary that in all the movements which have resulted in the present enormous extension of the business of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Mr. Thompson, as its president, took an active and leading part and is deserving of the credit. Next to him is a gentleman named Samuel Ray, who joined the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1871. And one of his most significant accomplishments is actually probably bringing the Pennsylvania Railroad into New York City. On January 1st, 1907, Ray laid the cornerstone of a massive new structure that was to be built at the corner of 7th Avenue and 33rd Street. No, this wasn't Madison Square Garden. It was Pennsylvania Station, the station that opened in 1910 that served the Pennsylvania Railroad and other railroads like the Long Island Railroad. He would go on to serve as the Pennsylvania Railroad's 9th president from 1913 to 1925. Next to him is a gentleman, Alexander J. Cassatt, who was the 7th president of the railroad from 1899 to 1906, just a couple years. He joined in 1861. He started as an engineer. He rose through the company's ranks. And although he was only president for a couple years, his impact was tremendous. You see, in the summer of 1901, Cassatt traveled to Europe for vacation. While he was there, Samuel Ray, who I mentioned a moment ago, who was then a vice president of the company, urged Cassatt to explore the new Gare d'Orsay train station. We know it today as the d'Orsay Museum in Paris, of course, but it was a train station back then. Cassatt spent a significant amount of time studying how the railroad used electric trains to travel in and out of the station. His observations cemented a plan. The Pennsylvania Railroad would build a tunnel under the Hudson River and bring its trains into New York City. And in fact, in December of that year, he announced this bold plan to tunnel beneath the Hudson River. It would actually allow the railroad to accomplish a long-standing goal it had, to run its trains directly into New York City and eliminate its need for ferries. And the last gentleman on here, on the right-hand side, is Ivy Lee. As the railroad was undertaking this massive project, the Pennsylvania Railroad hired Ivy Lee and his partner, George F. Parker. They had a simple goal in mind. They wanted to change the public perception around the railroad. In doing so, they inadvertently or unexpectedly perhaps spawned a new industry, public relations. It was quite shocking to everybody, apparently, and even the Wall Street Journal took notice of this and said that the railroad recognizes the value of having the news of this great enterprise put accurately before the public. This is a departure on the part of this railroad. That's a backhanded compliment if ever there was such a thing. So if you like or dislike public relations, you can blame the Pennsylvania Railroad. But to do this required a lot more work up and down the line. This wasn't building a tunnel and building Penn Station wasn't just a singular project. It was really part of a larger infrastructure initiative that happened throughout the line in the 1880s or 1890s and the 1900s. And it involved elevating tracks. In the 19th century, the railroad really ran through the heart of cities at ground level. But the Pennsylvania Railroad realized that they could elevate their tracks, have their trains run on a separate grade, and it would be safer and improve operations. And so over the years, what they did is in places like Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1893, they completed a trestle. Elevations happened up and down the line. In 1901, they announced plans to build elevated tracks in Wilmington, Delaware. It required a new station, which the railroad opened a few years later, a station that still stands in the heart of the city. And even a few years later, in 1913, the Pennsylvania Railroad opened a new $60,000 station along a newly elevated section of track in Rahway, New Jersey. This bottom postcard on the right-hand side of the slide. Well, these were incredible projects and really changed the railroad and started making it the line that we know today. The tracks were not actually elevated everywhere up and down the line. Sometimes that caused problems for communities and people in those communities. This is actually a postcard pre-elevation of a street in Rahway, New Jersey. But I wanted to use an example of Grove Avenue in Metuchen to really illustrate some of the problems that a railroad might cause for the community. I presume everybody, or most of us on the call at least, are familiar with the railroad overpass there. But for years, if you can believe it, it was actually a grade crossing. And by 1937, the local council had petitioned the railroad for some sort of safety measure. And the railroad complied. They installed warning gates, probably looked a lot like this. They also decided to put a watchman on duty from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. But it remained an active grade crossing into the 1940s. A series of wrecks, sadly some of them fatal, led to demands for even more change. The state got involved in the 1940s and actually ultimately ordered the railroad to close the grade crossing in 1941. They suggested building a highway overpass, an underpass overpass. Doesn't seem to have actually inspired much action. The board again in 43 ordered the grade crossing to be closed. That still didn't apparently make anyone jump into action, because a decade later, the board again ordered the elimination of the grade crossing and an underpass for traffic. The railroad this time finally agreed, and a new underpass opened in 1959. And you thought infrastructure projects today took time. This is not a new phenomenon. Aside from the safety aspects of elevating the tracks, there were some operational benefits to the railroad. The Railway Age, trade publications that's actually still around today, noted in 1907 that when the improvements are completed, they will probably result in the saving of several minutes running time between Philadelphia and Baltimore, marking another step in the accomplishment of the Pennsylvania Railroad eventually to reduce its running time between New York and Boston to 4 hours. Think about that, 4 hours. 70 years earlier, it took 5 or 6 hours to travel from New York to Philadelphia. Now it's taking 4 hours to travel between New York City and Washington. And pretty soon after this article was written, trains would actually enter New York City. But to do so, we got to go back to that whole idea of a tunnel. This is probably the single most significant change on the corridor. The Pennsylvania Railroad's decision to build a tunnel into New York City. And it's actually one, if you watch the news a lot and follow the news, this is one that we're discussing a lot today. This tunnel is still in use, and we're looking at how we might be able to replace this tunnel. In conjunction with building the tunnel, the railroad announced plans to build the massive new station in the heart of Manhattan. The railroad acquired property for the station and simply named it with a great name, Pennsylvania Station. Perhaps what they lacked in creativity, they made up for in vision. But this idea of entering New York City was not new for the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's something that had come up for many years. They had long discussed how they might enter the city. Until this point, trains terminated on the Pennsylvania Railroad, they terminated in Jersey City. And from there, you would have to hop on a ferry and go to various points in the city. As I looked at it, it seemed like there were really only two options. You could either build a bridge or build a tunnel. The bridge had been tried before. An industrialist named DeWitt Clinton Haskins actually tried to tunnel as well. He started tunneling in 1879. He spent about a decade on his project, didn't get very far. After several blowouts, he decided to abandon it. A few years later, the Pennsylvania Railroad hired an engineer, Gustav Lindenthal. The idea was to design a massive structure across the river. He secured a federal charter for his bridge. The railroad decided that they would approach other railroads to split the cost of this massive project. When the other railroads balked at that idea, of how much it might actually cost to build this bridge, they said thanks, but no thanks, leaving the Pennsylvania Railroad to go it alone. For his part, Lindenthal didn't build the bridge across the Hudson River, but he did design other bridges in New York City, including the Hell's Gate Bridge elsewhere in the Northeast Corridor. But building a tunnel wasn't not that it was simple to just build a tunnel, but it required more than just tunneling under the river. One of the concerns that the Pennsylvania had was what locomotives to use. They couldn't use steam locomotives. In fact, starting in 1908, steam locomotives were banned in New York City or in Manhattan. So back to that idea that Alexander Cassatt had, we're going to use electric trains to do this. So what happened is steam trains would go to a point in Harrison, New Jersey. Manhattan Transfer, it was called. Passengers would get off the train and they would hop on another train, an electric power train, into the city. As Cassatt himself noted, after years of exhaustive study, the conclusion has been reached that a tunnel operated by electricity is in every way the most practical, economical, and the best both for the interests of the railroad company and of the city. That was a quote he gave to the New York Tribune newspaper. The tunnels and the massive station in the heart of Manhattan opened in 1910, Pennsylvania Station, Penn Station, more as we call it today, and called it back then as well. As the crowd passed through the doors into the vast concourse, on every hand were heard exclamations of wonder, for none had any idea of the architectural beauty of the new structure. That's what the New York Times said about the opening of this incredible structure. May not be the reaction first-time visitors to Penn Station today have, but this was an incredible structure. I wish I could have seen it. It's marvelous, the pictures of Penn Station. It's starting to change again today, perhaps, with the opening of the Moynihan Train Hall, which opened at the beginning of the year, which I haven't seen myself. Soon enough, hopefully, when COVID is over. Perhaps in a couple of years, when we go back and do an updated history of the Northeast Corridor, we'll point to the opening of the Moynihan Train Hall as another pivotal moment in the history of the Northeast Corridor. While the Pennsylvania turned to electrification to enter the city, the entire corridor itself was not electrified. It was, at the early days, just that short stretch between Manhattan Transfer and Harrison and New York City. It would take another 2 decades, really, for the Pennsylvania to electrify the rest of its line. And that happened under the leadership of the gentleman on this slide, William W. Atterbury, who was president of the Pennsylvania Railroad in November of 1928, when he announced yet another bold plan. Think about this, November 1928, we're just before the start of the Great Depression. And he had this idea of eliminating steam power on the Northeast Corridor. He wanted to electrify a 325-mile stretch of the line between New York City and Wilmington, Delaware. The railroad, by its own estimate, said the project would cost $100 million and take upwards of 8 years to complete. By 1931, in fact, locomotives were pulling trains between Wilmington and Trenton. Other sections followed. And in January of 1933, engineer George S. Gould sat behind the controls of locomotive number 207 as it pulled out of Penn Station in New York. It was the first electric-powered train to operate from New York City to Baltimore. But that wasn't, Philadelphia, New York City to Philadelphia. But that wasn't the end of the story. In 1934, after successfully electrifying the line between New York City and Wilmington, Atterbury announced another massive project that would employ 25,000 workers to finish electrifying the line down to Washington, D.C. Think about that, 25,000 workers, 1934, in the midst of the Great Depression. It's almost hard to believe that the Pennsylvania Railroad would ever come to an end. The standard railroad of the world. I mean, again, we've just talked about some incredible projects, tunneling to New York City, electrifying the line, hiring 25,000 workers in the middle of the Great Depression. This railroad seemed like it would go on forever. But after the years of dominating service, the 1960s were a time of trouble for the railroad. As early as 1957, the Pennsylvania began merger talks with its competitor railroads, longtime competitor, the New York Central. After a few years, in 1968, that merger actually happened and it formed another railroad, the Penn Central. It closed the books on the storied history of the Pennsylvania Railroad and really a storied era for the Northeast Corridor. It began a few years of perhaps transition, we should call them, that really just changed the face of transportation, public transportation in this country, and long distance rail travel. There were a lot of factors that led to the demise of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I don't know if we can necessarily pinpoint one per se, but there were a few federal highway acts in the 1950s. The interstates began their construction. Commercial air travel started becoming more prevalent. And ultimately what happened with the Penn Central, it was the combination of several railroads, not just the New York Central, but also the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. But it was short-lived. The problem was they pulled together a bunch of failing railroads and merged them into one railroad, thinking that would lead to success. It didn't happen. The Penn Central was troubled from the start. That's a nice way of putting it. And as a result, its history was brief. At one point, if you can believe it, the Penn Central lost $1 million per day. $1 million per day. The railroad that was formed in 1968 filed bankruptcy by 1970. Despite its bankruptcy, it did continue to operate until 1976. Around this time, Congress stepped in and started passing various legislation and various measures. It'd be impossible to detail them all in a short moment of time, but there were acts like the 3R Act and the 4R Act. And ultimately what happened is Congress created railroads like Amtrak, which began operations in 1971. It created Conrail, which began hauling freight in April of 1976. In addition to freight, Conrail also operated commuter trains into the early 1980s. And when Conrail shed its commuter operations, it effectively ushered in the newest era on the Northeast Corridor, the modern era that we know today. And when we look at the Northeast Corridor, it's perhaps easy to today look at it from a holistic standpoint. Look at it as a 457-mile-long stretch of railroad, among the heaviest traveled in the country and in the world. High-speed trains, regional trains, long-distance Amtrak trains pass over it. But it also hosts commuter railroads. And I think for so many people, their touch point with the Northeast Corridor, even if they don't necessarily realize it, is on New Jersey Transit trains. It's on SEPTA trains. It's on MBTA trains up in the Boston area, MARC trains down in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. In fact, more than 3,400 commuter trains hauling more than 1.1 million riders travel across the Northeast Corridor every day, or at least they did before COVID began. And it's the commuter aspect of the line that helps so many communities like Edison and Metuchen grow. I found this quote in the Metuchen Recorder newspaper from 1905 that talked about the borough, and it said, "It's a very desirable place for suburban homes. And without question, the land in this section is more favorably located than any other place between Metuchen and New York City." With that in mind, I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to share some of the stories about the railroad in Metuchen and how the railroad has helped shape the community. It really is a great railroad town. 3 railroads at one point passed through the city, in addition to the trolley line that ran through town. Railroads like the Lehigh Valley built tracks through Metuchen, which connected with the Northeast Corridor, and starting in 1879, actually sent its trains over the Northeast Corridor tracks into Jersey City, an arrangement that lasted for about 12 years. Another railroad appeared a few years later, the Reading Railroad, which is actually still in existence today. It's operated by Conrail. We talked a few minutes ago about some of the early railroads that were built, and the original railroad that built the train line through Metuchen is the New Jersey Railroad and Transportation Company, which was chartered in 1832, but ran its first train through the area in 1836. And if you can believe it, in 1836, it was a single track. The railroad didn't add a second track until about 1860. Of course, the Lehigh Valley that I mentioned a few minutes ago came about in the 1870s. The current depot that we are familiar with today opened up in 1888, and the third railroad entered in 1892. So I want to take a moment to delve into 3 railroad stories that I think illustrate various aspects of the railroad. I have a daring cigarette heist that happened a few years ago. I've got a little bit about the 1977 derailment that happened in the heart of the city. But I wanted to begin with a fun story that happened in 1893. The John Bull locomotive. This locomotive is really one of the pioneer locomotives in the country. It was built in 1831 by a British company, and it came over and began operations on the Camden and Amboy locomotive as their locomotive number 1. It operated for the first time in September of 1831. It was also initially named at one point in honor of their president, Robert L. Stevens. But by April 1893, when the locomotive was about 60 years old, the railroad decided that they were going to send it to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The Pennsylvania Railroad steamed up the locomotive, and it departed Jersey City en route for Chicago. It stopped at various points up and down the line, people turning out to see this venerable steam locomotive. In Metuchen, it briefly stopped, and according to one newspaper account, the ladies of Metuchen presented a box with beautiful buttonhole bouquets to guests and the train crew. I couldn't find in the research I didn't necessarily see a picture of the locomotive in Metuchen. There may or may not be one, but I found this old postcard of the locomotive when it stopped in Rahway and was met by dignitaries there. Dignitaries who aren't necessarily demonstrating proper railroad safety etiquette, but nonetheless, you could see the kind of people who would have enjoyed seeing this incredibly old, this locomotive that was 62 years old, steaming from Jersey City to Chicago. It's incredible. Must have been incredible to see. But not every encounter that a railroad had in a community was necessarily a positive one. And as an example of that, I wanted to turn the clock a few years ahead to December 8th, 1938. If you can picture this, a westbound Pennsylvania Railroad freight train was pulling through the area, 71 cars it was hauling. It ground to a halt near the Grove Avenue grade crossing. A group of thieves, apparently thought to include maybe 5 or 8 men at first, jumped into action pulling cases of cigarettes from one of the train's cars near the back of the train. They started throwing them into a waiting getaway truck. The police thought that the crime had been carefully planned by persons familiar with the train schedule in this vicinity, a newspaper recorded of the episode. At least one report indicated the investigators thought perhaps there was an inside job. The train crew stumbled upon the thieves as they searched for what caused their train to come to a halt, and the robbers ordered the crew into the caboose. Varied reports have been heard concerning the robbery with respect to the actions of the train crew, the Daily Home News reported. One report is to the effect that the crew was cowered by guns brandished by the bandits. In all, the thieves made off with about 50 cases of cigarettes, each containing 50 cartons of smokes. Authorities valued the haul at about $2,000, below their original estimate of $60,000. After the theft, the train crew repaired a broken air hose, which caused their train to come to a stop, and continued on their journey. A railroad tower employee alerted authorities. FBI agents from Newark joined the investigation since the theft involved interstate commerce. Agents descended on the scene to investigate alongside borough police and county detectives. They took plaster casts of the getaway truck's tire marks. It was apparently some good police work, because in March of 1939, authorities announced they had charged 2 men in connection with the theft. And last but not least, of the 3 episodes in Metuchen that I wanted to highlight, it's the 1977 derailment of a freight train, which, if you look at it in the grand scheme of railroad history, was a decidedly minor event. But for the borough, it was apparently quite the spectacle to have witnessed. And although it predates me, I first learned of this wreck through newspaper articles that were once upon a time on display in the Metuchen Library. And reading those, even as a small kid, I was intrigued about this wreck. It happened on June 22nd, 1977. It was an 87-car Conrail freight train traveling from Virginia to New York when 17 cars derailed as it was switching tracks near the Lincoln Interlocking Tower. The ensuing wreck sent at least one boxcar into Main Street, blocking all 4 tracks of the Northeast Corridor in the process. An investigation revealed that the train was traveling at between 27 and 45 miles per hour at the time, and an overheated freight car axle, a situation known as a hot box, was to blame for the derailment. But the real issue of the derailment was the potential leak of hazardous materials. And it really, even though this derailment wasn't necessarily major, no one was injured, it was a troubling sign for railroads. In New Jersey, it was one of 10 wrecks between April 1977 and June 1978 involving cars with hazardous materials. While some of these mishaps were to blame on human error, track defects was the leading cause of these derailments. Simply put, the state of railroads in the 1970s was subpar. This wasn't an exclusive problem for the Northeast Corridor. This was a problem with railroads throughout the country. This particular derailment sparked a congressional hearing. U.S. Representative Fred Rooney of Pennsylvania noted, "The accident is another example of what I consider to be the seriousness of the current deterioration of rail safety." He said that in a July 1977 subcommittee hearing. And more than 40 years later, even as the track conditions have improved on the Northeast Corridor, the Northeast Corridor is a freight railroad still. There are a few notable exceptions to that, around Penn Station in New York, for example, and South Station in Boston. But 4 freight roads continue to operate over the corridor: CSX, Norfolk Southern, Conrail, and in the Boston area and Massachusetts area, the Providence and Worcester Railroad. Combined, these railroads carry about 350,000 carloads of freight every year over the Northeast Corridor. And there are about 250 businesses that ship or receive freight on the line. And this is a perfect segue as we move into what's next for the Northeast Corridor. because there's constant discussions about improving the tracks, improving the infrastructure, improving the trains that operate over the Northeast Corridor, and what that might look like. As I've mentioned a couple times, and I think I've driven home the point, but the Northeast Corridor has continually evolved since its earliest days. If you look at it just perhaps through stations on the line, as a great example, you could look at stations like South Newark and North Rahway that have closed and are no longer around. You could look at it as additional stations that have opened. Perhaps it's Metro Park or Secaucus Junction. Stations have changed their names over the years. Look at Edison, it's a great example. It was originally named Stelton and renamed Edison in October of 1956. And the trains themselves have evolved over the years. The picture on this slide is of the new $2.5 billion Acela train sets that are expected to enter service starting next year. It's going to be 28 in total, starting in 2022. But the reality is, these new Acela train sets are just the latest in the future Northeast Corridor. We could go back to the 1930s, for example. We could look at the GG1 locomotive, which is the locomotive on the upper left-hand corner of this slide. It was the centerpiece of the electric era. This is the locomotive that George Gould was sitting at in 1933 when he operated from New York to Philadelphia. I don't want to geek out too much on locomotives, but I do know we have a couple of rail fans on the call today, so I do like to play to them a little bit as well. We could talk about something like the E60 locomotive built by General Electric, the locomotive in the upper center. Amtrak started using these locomotives in the mid-1970s. They had a series of problems, which prompted the railroad to look for another locomotive. What they ended up doing was testing locomotives from Sweden and France. Locomotives like the RC4 in the upper right-hand corner. That was actually the locomotive that led to the engine on the bottom left here, the AEM7, a locomotive that electromotive division of General Motors built. In fact, they built 65 of them, 54 of them purchased by Amtrak. Because of its Swedish origin, rail fans affectionately know of this locomotive as a Swedish meatball. Some people also call it a toaster. And of course, on the bottom right-hand side, we have two of the more modern train sets and motive power that you might see today. The bottom middle is, of course, the Acela, which is soon to be replaced. And the bottom right is an Amtrak City Sprinter, locomotive that Amtrak ordered, I believe, in 2016 for use on the Northeast Corridor. So the railroad and the corridor really continue to evolve today. And what the future holds is really hard to predict. But what I can say is that the story of the Northeast Corridor is in many ways the perfect example of railroad history. It's the story of ingenuity, of grit and determination, of visionaries and of communities. Anyone who's ever hopped a commuter train on the corridor is part of its history. It originated from the idea of finding a better way to travel, of connecting towns, facilitating commerce. I look back to something that the directors of the New Jersey Railroad wrote in 1840. Formerly, the passage between Philadelphia and New York was performed with great personal discomfort and no small hazard of limb and life. Merchandise was transported from city to city at great expense and subject to all the difficulties and dangers of a coasting voyage. Now, passengers are carried from city to city during the most inclement season with nearly the same comfort as they enjoy at their own firesides. Some days a trip on the Northeast Corridor may not feel as comfortable as our own firesides, but it surely beats a 20-hour wagon ride between Philadelphia and New York. With that, I'll say thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I just want to mention we're recording this program. Todd graciously allowed us to do that. So just be aware if you ask a question, we're recording you. And obviously unmute yourself if you need to.
I have a question. I wanted to ask, was there any federal funds used to build the tunnel connecting New Jersey and New York City?
could double check that, but I believe it was private at the time. But I could double check that for you and tell for sure. But I believe it was all funded by the Pennsylvania Railroad.
That's amazing.
True. That's true.
I have a question.
Yep.
I always considered Railway Station to be a pretty important station with Northeast Corridor connecting with Jersey Coast. Was that when that was built? I think you said 1901. Was it built to connect those two, or was the line from Jersey Coast, did that come later?
I believe they were probably, oh, that's a good question. I'd have to double check that as well. They probably were there originally. I know that station's been reconfigured a lot over the years, and the current, if I'm not mistaken, the current version of it was built in about 1999, but it's kind of a replacement of a station that Penn Central built in 1974-75. And so its configuration is a little bit strange for a lot of the other stations on the Northeast Corridor. I'd have to look a little bit deeper at the history of the Jersey coastline, but I imagine it would have interchanged there pretty early on, but I would have to dig a little bit deeper before I gave you a definitive answer. I'm happy to look into it. I put up my email address on this slide here. So if you want to send me an email, I can pull into it and double check it for it. I'd be happy to respond back to you.
The Jersey Central came up along the chemical coast from Jersey City, and then the Penn came over from Rahway.
Okay.
That connector was built later.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yep. You're right. Yep. That sounds right.
I got a comment about the Manhattan transfer.
Yes.
You talked about passengers swapping trains there. Actually, it was primarily an engine swap from steam to the electrified stuff.
Yeah, they did a little bit of both, but yeah, absolutely. And also there was originally an H&M, Hudson and Manhattan line that operated there as well, which they ended up closing Manhattan Transfer when they built Penn Station in Newark in the 1930s.
Realigned it, right?
Yeah, really, yeah. It's roughly in the Harrison area, if I'm not mistaken.
Todd, I had a question on the electrification.
Sure.
Some of the earlier pictures that you show going into the tunnel look like they were third rail electrified. And I believe at one point they started the overhead electrification. Do you have any idea when that occurred?
I'm not sure the definitive year. Early on, it was third rail, and there actually is a third rail still in the tunnels today. It's not necessarily used except for emergency purposes. The trains operated on third rail, and probably the overhead would have been as part of that larger project. I'd have to double check that to be 100% certain on it. But when they electrified the rest of the line, I imagine is when they changed it over to the overhead catenary lines.
And one other question with
Sure.
the Lehigh Valley, when they started initially, I guess, going through Metuchen with the station down off of Lake Avenue down or down closer to Amboy Avenue. But when they moved it over to Lake Avenue itself and the Pennsylvania Railroad, was that a common station or was there still two stations, one at Main Street and one at Lake?
There were separate ones. Well, if there were on the Pennsylvania, you mean, or for the Lehigh?
Yeah. Did the Pennsylvania and Lehigh ever share the station in Metuchen?
My understanding is they had two separate stations based on the research I did into it. And I believe the Pennsylvania tore down the Lake Avenue station in about 1888 when they opened up the current station. But my understanding, Lehigh actually had two stations in Metuchen at one point in time. One was near the interchange, which is the Greenway today, is the Lehigh Valley line.
Right.
And part of that turnout is still there, if I'm not mistaken. It's a little bit of a side track there. Kind of if you're looking on the platform past the cemetery, it kind of spins off to the right there. And I think they still park some track equipment there and other miscellaneous items at times. But I think the Lehigh had two stations within Metuchen over the years. Again, they interchanged starting in 1879. They actually put their trains on the well, it wasn't the Northeast Corridor then, but the Northeast Corridor into Jersey City. And later in World War there was an order that allowed them to actually run their trains into Penn Station. As I understand it, they did the switching onto the Northeast Corridor in the Newark area, though not necessarily in Metuchen. But I believe they had separate train depots, is my understanding of it.
Yeah, the second station was down by, I might get them mixed up.
Durham,
or
yeah.
By the Quick Check or 7-Eleven, whatever it is nowadays.
Yeah, I think was Durham first and then Lake Avenue. I have to go back and look at that. I always get the two confused. But yeah, they had.
Oh, in terms of, yeah, I don't know which station came first, but.
Yeah, and the Pennsylvania had several stations at over the years within Metuchen. I think they had 3 main ones over the years. It's kind of hard to believe the number of stations that there were. Trains stopped a lot back in the day, and one of the things, particularly in the 60s and 70s, what they started doing is they started closing a lot of stations as well, and that's when you got stations like Metro Park came into being. They closed. There was a station in Islin. There were several that were closed. I think South Newark closed around 1974 as well.
Yeah. Colonia closed also.
Yep, that was another one. There were a lot that closed, and they've opened several over the years. Jersey Avenue is another example of a station that's relatively newer compared to the rest of the corridor. So they do open them at times. And I know they're talking about another one in New Brunswick that's sort of on again, off again. I think it's North Brunswick, it would be called. Yeah,
they broke ground for it.
Oh, did they? Okay, yeah. That's been going on for about 10 years now. I feel like they've been trying to build that station. So they do, change stations over the years based on how people. Jersey Avenue is a great example with the car culture, and as we change how we commute and move about, leads to different types of station. Metro Park as well is a similar type station.
If you look at Metro Park and Metuchen, and then at the time, there were a few stops in Metuchen, even less in Edison. Now, you normally get the express from Newark right down to Metro Park, and then they stop at Metuchen and Edison. And Edison's parking has gotten horrendous also.
Sure, yeah. It's interesting in Metuchen, in particular, if you look at over the years, in the 60s, they always talked about moving the station as well, potentially putting in an area where they could put more parking around it. And so there's sort of always an ongoing discussion about how to realign. And that sort of gets back to that whole idea of the evolving Northeast Corridor, right? Even just the way the stations are situated, how can we put them in places that work with the community better? And it's a discussion. It was fascinating if you go back and read articles from the 50s and 60s, how they're having these conversations. And it sounds a lot like conversations we might have had last week with the city council. So you realize we talk about the same thing over and over again, and sometimes we don't always solve the questions that we have. We just talk about them for 50 years. Go ahead.
Todd, talk a little bit about, please, maybe the impact of the economy that these stations had in the Northeast Corridor was built when it replaced the stage lines.
Sure, yeah. It's you can see it in it's similar actually to a lot of places throughout the country as well, just in terms of how businesses were located, how industries were located. I know when I talked a lot about today, we talk a lot about it from a passenger railroad standpoint, but freight was a huge driver for how stations were built, and all of them had freight houses that were part of these stations. Even I mentioned Rawway, for example, when it opened a station in 1913. It wasn't just passenger stations that they built. They built freight houses as alongside of it to be able to haul freight for all these different communities. And if you look at where industries are located, and they're all located up and down train lines, not just in the Northeast, but really throughout the country. I mentioned there's even today you can really see the economy and the millions of dollars that of economic impact that railroads have. But replacing the stagecoach line, really the big piece of that was just the time and the ability and the safety and the ability to move from point A to point B quickly and be able to get goods from point A to point B quickly. If you think about New York to Philadelphia in 20 hours, it's incredible. 20 hours to take a stagecoach line from New York to Philadelphia. And now you can do it, now you can do it in a couple hours on a train, but within 4 hours on a train. It just made everything closer. And in terms of a dollar amount piece of it, it would be there's probably studies that you could look at that would estimate how much it did, but just really to be able to close the gap and be able to just move goods from point A to point B is just, it's really just incredible.
I have a question
Sure.
about the electrification
Mhm.
on the line. And was the direct current similar to that which was used on the Lackawanna, which I think electrified around 1932? But that's like started out as a 300 watt or 300 volt direct current system. Were they using the same kind of system on the Pennsylvania Railroad, or was it a different system?
That's a good question. That might be one of those that I have to go back and look into. I know there were different systems actually on the Northeast Corridor. I think there's actually 3 different systems in use. North of New York City has a different system, if I'm not mistaken, than sort of west and south of the city. I'm going to guess they were different, but that is just a guess. I could go back and look. That's one of the ones that I probably have to dig a little bit deeper to be able to definitively answer that question. But
The PRR used 10,000 volt AC. That was for the overhead traction. The signal system is a little bit different.
Yeah, I was referring to what was actually powering the locomotives or the electrical cars. And when they did the Lackawanna, it was shortly before Edison died, and Edison was there participating in the opening of it because it was a direct current system. And he sort of lost out on alternating current for other applications around the country. So I was kind of wondering if the Pennsylvania Railroad was also something similar or different.
Definitely.
Good trivia question.
it is, and I can look at, if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to look into it a little bit deeper. I don't want to give you a wrong answer.
It definitely was different.
I would imagine it was different. Would be just an educated guess, maybe not very educated, but an educated guess at that.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take 3 more questions and then let Todd have a break. Thanks for coming out. Todd, one thing I want to mention, I don't know if you noticed, Tyrene said that mentioned about Gustav Lindenthal living in Metuchen.
I believe he died in Metuchen, if I'm not mistaken.
Tyrene,
passed-
know more about that.
I'm a big fan of his.
Well, yeah, it's he did
reasons.
Yeah, he did incredible thing from an engineering standpoint. I mean, he did some incredible projects, and I just mentioned the Hell's Gate Bridge briefly in passing, and that would be the one problem, I guess I would say, with when you do presentations. You could go on. There's so many avenues you could go down and look into. Like the Hell's Gate Bridge is a great bridge that he's credited with. That is massive and still around today. You can still see it today.
One question. My son Zachary, he is a huge train enthusiast, and we saw the art growing up, and that's him. We watch the trains all the time, and we got your book. So he had it for you, and he wants to ask it.
Sure.
What was like in the area before the rail line was built? So like for an example, like there's like a small road, and like before they built it, what was there?
Okay, that's a good question, Zach.
Absolutely. In different places, in some places there was not much. Other places had small roads, and what you would have to do is you'd have to jump in a wagon or a stagecoach. And the roads, we think of roads today, right? They're paved, right? You could ride your bike on it. They're nice and flat and relatively smooth, I guess I should say. But this is a dirt road that was very bumpy, and it was rocky, and it was probably a very uncomfortable ride. There were, depending on where you were, there were probably some houses, some small towns that existed, but not like we know of today. When you think of all along the line, if you take the train from Metuchen to New York City, it's basically built up the entire way. It would have been not built up the entire way before the railroad, and it would have been much more green and open space.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a great question. And keep watching trains.
Yeah, every day, every day.
Fantastic. I love it.
I have a question.
Sure.
What was a horse-drawn railroad like? I mean, train.
Slow.
Horse-drawn train.
Not comfortable, I'm sure. You know, they did that a lot. Weight was a big concern that the railroads would have had, and it would have been a lot like you know, horse-drawn, mule-drawn streetcars would have been, in the sense of they just used literal horsepower to pull trains. There's actually a section of the railroad that was built. It was called the Bergen Cut, on the way to Jersey City, which is actually part of the path line to Jersey City today. And when they built this area, they had to fill in some areas. They had to make a big cut through the area, and they were actually concerned about settling of the tracks. And they were worried that the weight of the train would, the way they built it, that with settling, that the tracks would be uneven and unstable. So they were worried about putting the weight of a true full locomotive on the track. So they would use horse-drawn, which basically it's a car that you would just attach to a horse or a team of horses and pull it. And it would have been much slower than a steam locomotive, perhaps faster than walking, but would have been, I would imagine, it would have been smoother, I guess, than a wagon, in the sense that you're still operating on rail, but basically it was like a train car being pulled by a horse.
Wouldn't that have been hard for a horse to go over if there were tracks just like we know tracks today? Was it different?
They weren't as ballasted necessarily as much. We think it's so ballast is basically all the rocks and gravel that are on it. And when you see the tracks today, they tend to be built up. Without getting too deep into the way that they built the construction piece of it, they really laid them more on the ground. They would try to even out the ground and lay it on the ground. So it was a little bit more even with the ground than we think of today. The reason you ballast tracks today was a couple of reasons. One, you want to get all the water away from it, and it allows the trains to operate faster because it's on a more even surface underneath it. The levels of construction in the 1830s and 40s, they weren't necessarily engineered as well as we might think of a railroad today. So it was a little bit flatter on the ground. And also the rails were a lot smaller back then. The way they do rail weight is it's like 100-pound rail, for example. What that means is a yard of rail weighs 100 pounds. Which is pretty common railroad weight that you might see on a rail today. But back then it would have been equivalent, probably would have been 15 or 20-pound rail, which is a lot thinner, a lot lighter, a lot smaller. So they weren't necessarily as elevated. The tracks themselves, they were closer to the ground, and it was less rocky, more sort of dirt and smoother. Probably still would have been really hard for the horse. Wouldn't have been the greatest work conditions, but the rails would have just looked a little bit different than we think of today, where they're sort of on a mound of gravel.
So do you have any pictures of that in your archive?
Do I have any pictures? I'm sure yes is the short answer to. I don't know if the archives has any. I think I've come across some. I could look, and if you want to send me an email, I could look, and if I can find any, I'd be happy to send you a link to some.
Okay, we'll take one last question. Going once, going twice. Okay, I want to, seeing there's no more questions, I want to thank Todd for coming out to do the program. One thing, if there's a plus to the pandemic, a lot of people, including myself, have learned how to Zoom. Todd is in Georgia, and as much as we would have loved to have flown him out, I don't know that the society can afford things like that, but it opens up a whole new world to who we can have as a speaker. It doesn't have to be someone necessarily local. So that again, I want to thank Todd, and
I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Think about purchasing his book, and the front cover is indeed a picture of Metuchen Station.
It was my requirement for the cover. It had to be in Metuchen.
That's great. So thanks to everybody for coming out, and hopefully we can see everyone in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd.
Thank
This
you.
was great.
Absolutely.
Really
And please feel free to, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to send me an email.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciated having you here.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. And like Steve mentioned, if anybody has questions, regular historical society stuff or want to get involved, please get in contact with us on Facebook or email, and we'll be happy to sell you books and other merchandise too. But yeah, thank you so much, Todd.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.